I wanted to talk about rematches because Andy Ruiz and Anthony Joshua are already in Saudi Arabia, ready for their anticipated rematch coming up in just over a week now. And I wanted to look back on the history of rematches, some of the famous ones, some of the rematches that stick in my mind, and try and work out who has the advantage going into a rematch. Is it the winner? Is it the loser? Is it the favourite? And going into this rematch, even though he's no longer the champion, Anthony Joshua is still the favourite. The bookies have got him favourite, not by the odds that it was last time, but he's still a strong favourite. And I think Andy Ruiz is about 2-1 against to retain the belts that he won, which in a way almost seems like he's just got the belts on loan. And in actual fact, to become heavyweight champion of the world, you don't have to win the belt once, you have to win it twice. And looking back at the history of these rematches, I went all the way back to the 1950s when Rocky Marciano beat Jersey Joe Walcott. He knocked him out in the late rounds. There's a very famous, iconic picture of that knockout. And the champion, Jersey Joe Walcott, was dethroned. And there was an immediate rematch, and Marciano won that rematch in much more emphatic fashion. He won it much earlier. And maybe the advantage lies with the person who won the first match. If you already have beaten a guy, sometimes you feel like you've got his number, that you know the way to beat him. And I think Marciano had another 2 fights after that with Ezzard Charles, and I think he had an immediate rematch and won the rematch again. And the next big rematch at heavyweight for the heavyweight title that I could remember was when Floyd Patterson lost the title to Ingemar Johansson of Sweden. And this time there was a rematch and Patterson won it back. He won his title back. And I think if a fight is close, then there is an advantage in the rematch for the loser, as they know what they need to do differently. The winner won, he may have scraped through, he may have won only just, but he doesn't really know what he needs to do. He hasn't learnt anything from that fight. But the loser, if he loses a close decision or a close fight, he knows what he needs to do to change. And that was the case when Patterson regained his titles from Ingemar Johansson. Then the next rematch that sticks in my mind would be Cassius Clay, as he was back then, against Sonny Liston. And the first fight, famously, when Muhammad Ali, as he became known, won the world title, I think aged 21. He was the youngest champion at the time. He defeated Sonny Liston on a TKO when Liston retired on his stool. And this was he was getting dominated. Cassius Clay, aka Muhammad Ali, was obliterating him, hitting him left, right and centre, and he just retired on his stool. He couldn't carry on. And that was following an incident where Ali claimed that Liston had put some kind of acid on the gloves, and as in punching him around the eye area, this irritant liquid had got into his eye, and Ali was telling Angelo Dundee, get him off, take the gloves off, I want to quit. He was pouring at his eye. Liston had obviously tried to cheat, and this was not the first time that one of his opponents had complained of this eye irritation in a fight with Sonny Liston. So he was certainly a dodgy guy, Liston, and he died in mysterious circumstances. He was involved with the mob. And the second fight, the rematch, which again went the way of the first fight, finished in very suspicious fashion. It finished with Sonny Liston sprawled out on the floor with a punch that didn't seem to land. The replay and the overhead angle showed that the shot barely brushed past his head, yet Liston was sprawled out on the canvas, rolling around like an Italian footballer that had been brought down in the box. So there was a rematch that went the way of the first fight again, and Muhammad Ali, as he became known, reigned supreme for several years and never lost his title in the ring. He was stripped of his title when he refused to fight in Vietnam, and in his absence along came another Olympic gold medalist, Joe Frazier, who wiped the floor with everyone, climbed up the ranks very quickly and won the world title in a knockout format competition, I think winning the vacant title from Jimmy Ellis, another prominent contender in those days. So then you set up this unique situation where you've got Joe Frazier, undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, but you've got Muhammad Ali, who has a legitimate claim to being the champion. He never lost his title in the ring, who comes back after his ban and after a couple of tune-up fights is fighting for the heavyweight championship of the world, the title that he never lost in the ring. And they called it Fight of the Century. And I had it on video. It was a great fight. And Frazier won it. Frazier retained his world heavyweight champion and solidified his claim to being number one. And he dropped Ali in the final round with that famous, iconic hook of his, which was... he had such a powerful hook because he'd broken his arm in his youth, and the way in which it had healed had left it kind of solid and crooked, but it gave him this incredible hook. So that was the fight of the century. Frazier won the title, and there was a rematch. And the rematch, the second fight between Ali and Frazier, it kind of gets lost in history. People don't really remember it because of what happened later and the thriller in Manila, which was the final fight, the decider or the rubber match. And there's been a lot of rematches in boxing history, but there hasn't been many trilogies. Off the cuff, I'm hard pushed to think of any trilogy. Manny Pacquiao and Margarito have had, I think, 5 fights in total. But not many heavyweights would fight each other 3 times. But before that rematch, Frazier is the new champion. Along comes the next Olympic gold medalist. The days when America churned out 3 Olympic heavyweight gold medalists in a row. Correction. Muhammad Ali won the title, the gold medal at light heavyweight, and then moved up to heavyweight as a pro. Mega Cossack is saying Ruiz a smash. Is that a vote for Ruiz, Andy Ruiz, in the up-and-coming rematch? I'll get there. I'm just progressing through the long history of heavyweight championship boxing. But Mega Cossack is putting his money on Andy Ruiz. If he's done it once, why not do it again? The way that my logic tells me is, if the fight is not close, if the loser gets obliterated in the first fight, then he'll probably get beaten in the second fight. But let's see as we go through history, because we got as far as George Foreman arriving on the scene. Olympic gold medalist, monster of a man. He defeats Joe Frazier in a very quick fight, has him down several times, and the famous commentator was saying, "Down goes Frazier, down goes Frazier," as it echoed across the airwaves, and this shocking newcomer has defeated the heavyweight champion. So that's it. Frazier loses the belt. Frazier has a rematch with George Foreman, and it goes exactly the same way. Almost a complete repeat. The only difference was Frazier had shaved his head and was bald. But he was obliterated yet again. And Foreman did away with him. So George Foreman has the title, and then famously there's this showdown in Kinshasa, Zaire, the Rumble in the jungle, and against all the odds, in the similar fashion, Muhammad Ali said, to the way that he came in to boxing and broke onto the scene by beating a formidable, huge heavyweight that everyone feared in the form of Sonny Liston. Muhammad Ali laid on the ropes. He invented the rope-a-dope, and he defeated George Foreman. And I'm sure people back then would have been anticipating a rematch. Foreman, who had been so dominant, who had done these kind of novelty shows of fighting several men in one night, and had completely obliterated Joe Frazier, who had been undefeated up until that point, loses to Muhammad Ali in this unorthodox style of fight where Ali laid on the ropes and Foreman punched himself out. You would have thought, wouldn't you, that there would be a rematch? I would have thought that, and it was Don King who promoted it. Don King was promoting even as far back as the 70s. He was the brains behind Rumble in the Jungle. You would have thought Don King, who loves a pound note, would have arranged an immediate rematch. He used to say it whenever his fighter would lose: "Let's dance again. Let's redo it and make some more money." But George Foreman disappeared and went away into obscurity, followed a religious calling, and returned mysteriously in the 90s to regain the heavyweight championship, this time from Michael Moorer. But that was a different generation, and George Foreman is one of these fighters that has kind of not only spanned many generations, but sort of has two eras to his career, with a huge gap in the middle. But Muhammad Ali had won the title back. He was now a two-time world champion. And along comes another Olympic medalist. I think I'm right in saying that Leon Spinks was an Olympic medalist. And he unexpectedly defeated Muhammad Ali on points in a close fight, but in a clear victory. Leon Spinks dethroned the great Muhammad Ali. And it was very early in his career as well. I think it was after something like 11 or 12 fights that Spinks defeated Muhammad Ali rather unexpectedly. Ali was obviously on the decline then, but being the guy who just couldn't quit, he came back and he made history. He went the distance and outpointed Leon Spinks and became for the third time, undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, making history, incredibly. But that was towards the end of his career. He then later fought, who did he lose to in his latter? His final fight was against Trevor Berbick. And then we have the era of Mike Tyson. And Tyson won the world title from Trevor Berbick, the first version of the title that he won before he became undisputed champion when he beat Michael Spinks, who was still regarded as the lineal champion. But the first rematch, I think, that Tyson fought would have been after he lost the title to Buster Douglas. Again, and this was another upset, huge upset out in Japan. Undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, Mike Tyson, loses to Buster Douglas, the unknown. But no rematch. Tyson disappears into obscurity, does his time in prison, and will reappear later to challenge for the belt, and he does regain a version of the world title from Frank Bruno. That was a rematch. That's a rematch that I forgot about, actually. Frank Bruno, Britain's great Frank Bruno, challenged Mike Tyson for the heavyweight championship, I think in 1992, was beaten, but he rocked Tyson in some of the early rounds. Bruno had Tyson going, and he sort of couldn't pull the trigger. He couldn't finish the job, but he did have that phenomenal straight right, one of the hardest crosses in heavyweight history. But he couldn't pull the trigger, and he lost a rematch when Tyson re-emerged on the scene in a bid to regain the heavyweight championship. Bruno had won the WBC belt from Oliver McCall, who had won it from Lennox Lewis, if my history is correct. So Bruno had a belt this time. Going into the fight, Tyson would have still been a hot favourite. Occasionally, the challenger is the favourite in a heavyweight title fight, as is the case with Ruiz and Joshua coming up. And Tyson won the rematch, again, pretty much brutal fashion. And then along comes Evander Holyfield, moving up from cruiserweight. He challenged for the heavyweight title, or for the version of it. The belts were splitting off at the time. WBA, WBC going their separate ways. And Holyfield becomes the second person in history to stop Mike Tyson. And in the 10th round, a disorientated Mike Tyson is stopped by the referee and suffers a technical knockout. And from Tyson's perspective, he'd suffered a lot of headbutts along the way. Holyfield was no stranger to putting the head in, and he was a come-forward fighter. And sometimes if you have your head down and you're that type of bullish brawler, the head will connect, and you can end up suffering bruises, gashes, and cuts from headbutts rather than from punches. But if the referee doesn't see it, the referee doesn't see it. So here comes another rematch. Tyson Holyfield 2, and that was a victory for Holyfield, but it was a disqualification victory because famously this is the fight when Mike Tyson bit part of Evander Holyfield's ear off. You don't see that very often. And then you had another rematch, or another, not a trilogy, but two fights between Lennox Lewis and Evander Holyfield. And this was when both of them held differing versions of the heavyweight championship, and the whole of boxing, the world was waiting for an undisputed champion. Who will it be, Lennox Lewis or Evander Holyfield? And they go head to head, and controversially, the first fight is scored a draw. But the majority of boxing fans, just like when Fury drew with Wilder, the majority of people thought that Fury won that fight. The majority of people that watched Lewis Holyfield won thought Lewis won it, and he was robbed of his victory by the controversial draw. And that, boxing is political sometimes. Judges can be biased. Home advantage has always been a factor. I always said when Deontay Wilder won the WBC belt and took it to America, that belt would stay in America for a very long time. It's hard to prize a belt away from a country like America, just like when Vladimir Klitschko had the majority of the belts and was operating out of Germany. If you go to Germany in his backyard, as Fury calls it, you almost have to knock him out to get a draw. But Lennox Lewis was robbed in the first match, and in the second match he put things right and he got the decision, and it was probably a fair, although that fight probably was closer in terms of what happened rather than the score, but he got the decision. And for once, and was the first time in a long time that all the belts were around the waist of one individual, and he was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. And that was the last... No, it wasn't. It wasn't the last rematch that Lennox Lewis had, because he also travelled to Africa, South Africa this time, and put his belts on the line against Hasim Rahman, an unfavoured outsider who got the so-called lucky punch. But is there a lucky punch in boxing? Every punch is thrown with intent. There's no such thing as a lucky punch, but this was a punch that landed and put Lewis out. That's it. The belts have gone. But being, as he was, undisputed champion, having the advantage of the rematch clause, there was an immediate rematch, and Lewis put the record straight, and he won in emphatic fashion, and the belts were all back in one place. We didn't have this fragmentation of the belts, and one of them went here, one of them went there, which is always the risk when a new champion wins the belts. It's not long before one of the governing bodies says, you have to defend against so-and-so, you have to defend against so-and-so. I mean, how long after Tyson Fury won the belts from Klitschko was it that the IBF belt was up for grabs? He had to relinquish it, because you can't fight every week if you're a professional heavyweight boxer. You can't defend against the IBF mandatory and the WBA mandatory and the WBC mandatory in the same night, unless you're George Foreman or something. But yes, Lewis lost to Rahman. Lewis beat Rahman, and that, I think, was the last rematch that he had in his career. His final fight against Vitaly Klitschko was a controversial TKO win when he beat Klitschko on cuts. The referee stopped the fight because Vitaly Klitschko, the older of the two brothers, had a terrible gash cut over the eyebrow. But Klitschko was ahead on points on all the cards. So, controversial. Did he run away from the rematch? In fairness, he'd done everything that he needed to do. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. And there you have, again, a situation when a champion retires, the belts go up in the air, and for the next 10 years, there were a few different names that had different versions of the belt. John Ruiz had a trilogy, I think, back and forth with Evander Holyfield. He won a version of the world title. And Ruslan Chagayev, Sultan Ibragimov, quite a few Eastern Europeans and Soviet bloc competitors came through, but it was the Klitschkos who dominated for 10 years. At one point, they had all the belts, and that was good enough for them. They'd promised their mother that they would never face each other in the ring, and they dominated for 10 years until Tyson Fury came along and upset the apple cart in Germany, in his backyard, as he put it. And there was a rematch set for Fury-Klitschko. Fury-Klitschko 2 was meant to happen. It never happened. Fury had mental health problems and was out of the ring for a very long time. Klitschko was out of the ring for a very long time also. He came back to challenge for the belts that Anthony Joshua had won, these vacant belts that went up in the air. And that rematch never happened. And there was talk of a Joshua-Klitschko rematch. It never happened. But the rematch that we have coming up in about a week or so, just under a week, this weekend, it's Andy Ruiz versus Anthony Joshua. I don't know. I don't know what to say. Joshua is the bookies' favourite. And the bookies are rarely wrong, because money matters to them, and they need to do their research. But they get it wrong sometimes. But I'm always eager for an upset. As much as Anthony Joshua is a decent guy and he's done a lot for boxing, it's always exciting times in boxing when the unexpected happens, when an underdog dethrones someone. And Andy Ruiz has done it once. Can he do it again? I was surprised that he won, but when you think about it, Ruiz has had about, I think, 10 more fights than Joshua. He's more experienced in that sense. And the only guy that beat him was Joseph Parker, the New Zealander. And Joseph Parker went the distance with Anthony Joshua. Joseph Parker lost his WBO belt to Anthony Joshua, but he went the distance, and Parker was the first fighter to go the distance with Anthony Joshua. So if you go the distance with someone, you're not a million miles behind them. And Andy Ruiz went the distance with Parker and lost a controversial decision for the vacant WBO belt. So they're obviously not leagues apart. And he's got very quick hands. He's only been knocked down once by Anthony Joshua. So in theory, if anyone can knock him out, it is Joshua. He does have that power. And when I saw him go down, Ruiz, that is, I thought, oh, here we go. It's going to be a quick night. And I think Joshua thought it would be a quick night. But Ruiz hung in there. And he turned it around. And what a turnaround it was. So I'll be excited to find out. I can't make it. Shall I make a prediction? I once, I think it was for the McGregor-Khabib fight, I made a very, very accurate prediction that it'll be in the backlog history of videos somewhere. But here, I'll make a prediction. I won't tell you who the winner will be, but I think this fight will go the distance. How about that? There you go. Cards are on the table. Joshua and Ruiz will go the distance, but I don't know which way it will go. Thank you for joining me. This has been Lessons for Life, very sports related. I know we do politics a lot of the time. Tonight was all about boxing. We'll do it all again soon. Different time, different place. We were here, and we're gone. Laters.